Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry. The civilization that gave us pyramids, mummies, and apparently festivals that could rival your college roommates' worst decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're rating in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's seize into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the ancient Egyptians' most famous botanical party trick, tableau lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, elegant petals, usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets like an ancient version of cheers. But this flower wasn't just ornamental. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties and mild psychoactive ones. Yes, the blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The method was simple. Take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes days. Then drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. The result was a soft, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make pyramid building sound like a fun group project. Now, to be clear, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. Blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and Dori rites. Holding theflor to one's nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. And okay, maybe also a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was everywhere in art. Pharaohs are shown holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe. Andy Van mummies got decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're traveling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. It's practical. But the blue lotus wasn't just ceremonial. Festivals could get wild, and blue lotus-infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Imagine a crowd under the stars, sipping lotus wine, feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For Thinsian Egyptians, that was spiritual fulfillment and also a very good night. There are religious holidays. And then there's the Feast of Drunkenness. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of saying, let's black out in honor of not dying. Subtle name? No. Accurate. Extremely. This annual celebration revolved around the goddess Hathor, who according to myth was once sent to punish humanity. But after a bloody spree that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson, so they tricked her into drinking red beer that looked like blood. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds poetical. You remember this? Often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard surrounded by strangers sighing praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Priests encouraged revelers tawdring as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of ableising and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, although whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honor the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand. And importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Kamatib? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. Participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget of everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with the kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer, for the Egyptians, was not just a social drink. It was practically a food group made from partially baked loaves of emma bread that were soaked in water, mashed and fermented into a chunky slurry. It resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread. But let's not pretend this wasn't a bowl of carbs in denial. This beer was scorned by everyone. Peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else savoring to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. Here's the twist. Beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mantra? Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but beer had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but beer had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Nile and often more reliable than your coworkers. In terms of strength, Egyptian beer ranged from mildly numbing to, I forgot how sandals work, while thiolkol. Content wasn't high by modern standards. The sheer quantity consumed made up for it. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, a daily ration of several liters, which means that half of ancient Egyptian labor was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Let's talk beer. Or rather, let's talk about a viscous beige bread adjacent fluid that the ancient Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and that modern brewers would call a war crime. Egyptian beer was less refreshing beverage and more fermented soup with ambition. Made by soaking half-baked loaves of emma bread in water, then mashing the whole affair into a lumpy stew and letting it ferment in open vats. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal if oatmeal had opinions. In a mild buzz, but despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic, this was the drink off the people. Everyone drank it: pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. Because when water might kill you, and milk was suspicious at best, a beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs. Because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy bread water. At temples and festivals, the beer might be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandra was intentional or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to payment method for laborers. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received daily beer rations, sometimes several liters per day. This meons the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were doing. It buzzed and breaded, and somehow the pyramids still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Taste probably awful. But if you're living in 1300 BC, covered in sand and trying not to dive to century, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic jugs, straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, and a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking kaifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very light-headed. Kaifi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, Honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. Mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase ursins or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone UB next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kefi like it's phrase 4. The soul, while a chant drones in Coptic monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged. They were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. Egyptians' key wasn't just air freshener. It was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator Al-Anon. Pliny the Elder later wrote that kaifi could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume its goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like in IKEA manuals. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done. But once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signaling that something holy was happening or Thatsamian was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, kaifi lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embarred in a spice rub. In short, kaifi was Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kaifi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, and Mandra was the slightly unhinged guest, you invited one scene immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation thought scared even seasoned priests, Mandra was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare. Used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandra earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. Theibas papyrus, that handy ancient medical text that sounds like it belongs in a Harry Potter class, lists mandrafur, insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart, which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. See, mandra contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, the kind off compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, Welcome to Night Terrors, starring Ra and a crocodile in a wig. Then there's the harvesting myth, according to latter folklore, likely inherited from these early associations. Pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly. Let's so naturally the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let that poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbors didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that Theplin had spiritual and slightly terrifying power fits right in. Mandra may have been used in rituals, fertility rites, or just slipped into beer for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't the everyday herb. Mandra was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't. Mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf? Used carefully, it could induce sleep, reduce pain, and maybe inspire a sensual poem or two. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of Shemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, The ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing reeds until they forgate their problems. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts, like the IBA's papyrus and Ramesseum papyrus mostly, as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy, of course. The Egyptians didn't roll joints or bake brownies with it, at least not that we know of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. It's inhaled accidentally. Well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense.
Ow.
Was it recreational? Officially? No. Unofficially. Probably when you're running a civilization in 120 heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem? No one blames you for accidental. And if your high priest starts talking to statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? It's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not ignore the priests. These were men trained to chant for hours, interpret dreams, and stare into incense smoke until something stared back.
Else.
If their rituals involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to facilitate communication with the gods, or at the very least with Thruel. Somewhere in the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the ancient Egyptian temple pharmacy, just behind the dried lizards and holy ointments, sat the opium stash. Small, wrinkled poppy pods imported from the eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. It's because when you've got plague, pain, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it. Though not native to Egypt, opium poppies likely made their debut throughout, with cypress or sit. The Egyptians were nothing if not enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain. It smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed gastrointestinal ague. It made temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a beat, ministered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories. Because of course it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "SH, don't worry about it." Naturally, it found a home in the temple Medicino Cabinet, that sacred shelf where healing met holy mystery. Priests doubling as physicians administered it during rituals and serious treatments. Probably while saying things like, "This, Willis, the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your mercer, opium could calm them both. The ancient texts don't call it opium directly. Of course, that would be too helpful. They reference extracts from poppy plant in the same vague way modern labels say natural flavors, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all medicinal. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And for elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Like many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was part cure, part comfort, and part controlled chaos. Used wisely, it soothed agony. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of tooth drills, snakes, and sandstorms, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Egypt was a sign of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Osir. But don't let the elegant amphorae fool you. Stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and occasionally mild experiments in altered consciousness. Egyptians flavored their wine with everything from mandra and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense. Ingredients that sound spiritual until you realize They were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main setting for these potent portables. At the Feast of Drunkenness, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy, it was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Sore joints? How about some frankincense-infused red aged 2 weeks? In a clay pot? Existential dread? Well, that one needed priestly supervision and possibly a floor mat. It wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as offerings in tombs, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average edible wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full psychedelic mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the Lotus garden, that was divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle. One thought could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and geometry, the ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine, not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-rhyme, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Hatherer had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honored combo of repetitive rhythmic, chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result? Sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. In many temples, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell. But within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised, sometimes they scolded. Sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of cayenne smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated, of course. Once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a pillar while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool to modern eyes. Divine possession might look like performance art meets heat stroke, but to ancient Egyptians, it was the pinnacle of religious experience. Firmament, when the divine broke through the sandstone barrier of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party, not in ancient Egypt. The line between Thelevine and the Thelevine and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like don't swim after eating, or maybe don't chisel hieroglyphs drunk. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead. They actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. Families visited tombs during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibove, a tailgate party if the tailgate was parked in a necropolis. They'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to the wall and hoping grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs had false doors carved portals through which the dead cold receive offerings. Whether this meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, ancient Egyptians believed the dead could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a decent bit of gossip. Naturally, they threw them parties. Music was played, incense always burned, libations were poured. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to talk, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on sacred offerings. It was like a family reunion, only with fewer arguments and slightly more embalming fluid. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance, they were also mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead. The dead in theory blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving hippos. Everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight in tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones or the occasional unsolicitedness from a former accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, Daydream might say. And also, the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye. It was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Horem wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stone wall, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned debauchery, ancient Egyptian revelry came with a price. And it usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue, yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast. The morning after hit just as hard. Archaeological texts are suspiciously quiet on the subject of hangovers, which is probably because no one was in theme mood to write hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been smited by Ra himself. But the evidence is there. Medical papyri describe pains of the head and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes just lying very still while pretending to commune with the gods. In more advanced cases, a ritual cleansing was recommended, which usually involved a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and possibly a stern lecture on moderation that no one remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in the temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say, "I overdid it," you said. "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter. It's much more respectable. And for the truly unlucky, there was always purging. Not metaphorically, literally.
Ow.
The Egyptians were fond of AICs, lovely concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret and being told this will restore your balance. Moments later, your balance is definitely gone. The priests, of course, fared better. They had training, they had ritual authority, and most importantly, they had people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revelers woke up with lotus petals in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they danced with a god or just ceremony, very committed to the role. Still, no one swore off the next celebration because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with beer, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbor's secrets in front of a statue. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. Packed snacks and drugs and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed, think again, just moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. Mummies were entombed with blue lotus petals, wine jugs, incense cones, and the occasional sealed Mr. Ridger, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Tutankhamun, for example. When Howard Carter cracked open, his tomb hadn't just found gold and furniture, found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars. This wasn't just luxury, it was strategic. The soul, or bar if you're fancy, needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself after all. Soprius and Embalmerus made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to prepare and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not now to carry Blue Lotus into eternity. Apparently you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the opening of the mouth ritual, which was supposed to let dead eat, speak, and let's be honest, sip that sacred fermented beverage with proper technique. Because it's hard to toast Osiris with a close sedge-job. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. Something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was psychoactive flour. Soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb, along with your amulets, your linen headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, Egypt, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandra with wine and not kill an eyeliner that could block out the sun. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power, but it also perfected just in healing and truth of civilization. But in managing the emotional, sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. You didn't ask. Officially, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen by gods to maintain Mayat, cosmic order. It was usually a falcon. Unofficially, a lot of temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash. Incense the budget. Temples were landowners, and the daily schedule of who gets to chant next to a burning bush of key until they pass Blue Lotus didn't grow itself. The religious had to harvest elite it, weren't just spiritual, ferment it, and whisper to it in sacred verse. They were state-sanctioned pharmacists supplying the population with everything from calming ointments, one that ran on psychedelic experiences, and occasionally disguised as holy communion, divine inspiration. It smelled strong, tingled on contact, the question made you speak in metaphor was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions, and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough, Tophered a private tomb and someone to fan you while you digested. You also had access to the good stuff, the kind off narcotic, rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic's scrolls. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a hierarchy, and adulterating substances followed the same rules as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, goat herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried flowers and pretending it was enough. While commoners got barley beer, and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances, mandrake blendsless with opium, imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take Pharaoh himself, the divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. Couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, then sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap wasn't indulgence. It was national security. Even in death, the elite kept theirs stashed close. Many tombs contain medicinal vials, incense cones, and winna jars, with labels so vague they may as well have read for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if Tutankhamun just liked to keep his options open. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions, beer thick enough to chew, weak incense, whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift, building obelisks. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely Khalid witchcraft. Heresy, or a very bad day to be a field laborer. After 14 chapters off sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask, what does all this really say about ancient Egypt? Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a serum and the smell of something smoldering that definitely wasn't foproved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states. It's not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were contraltimical theater with incense, chanting, and psychotropic tea for the cast anti-strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their Blue Lotus spars and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, butanly, if you could afford. The luxury tomb package with optional afterlife miniar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from modern humans. Meditating with essential oils or arguing about micro-doing podcasts, they just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations more seriously. So, what does this mean for us? Maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wild flowers, and a trance where you barked like Anubis, so be it. Florence, late 1400s, the air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume off crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind-off madness. The obsession with beauty, and not just any beauty, Renaissance beauty, the kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it killed you. Enter Sarasa, a luxurious silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice, and beyond smeared this shimmering poison across their cheeks. Foreheads and décolletage, tochi, that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant laboring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, Sarusa was layered on like Venetian stucco. So women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant ghostly glow right up until the source appeared. And when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. Yaukno, like a Renaissance band-aid, one that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine marketed as elegance. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noble women wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship. Soft paler the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost. But perhaps the most ironic part, the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient. Rose water distillations and camphor-laced tonics. They literally smelled like angels while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a bottle painting or a particularly fashionably Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high-rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared, so women willingly yanked outrows of hair from their brows and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or cat dung. This cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even scorched stray hairs off. With candle flames, because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows thin, arched and barely visible, if at all. The truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace wasp painted in later, often with burnt cork or powdered charcoal. Which sounds elegant until you realize it smears terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quicklime, and arsenic, another charming blend. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth until it didn't, and the scalp. Hair was gathered up in tit-tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair. The human rib cage had no business aspiring to someone else's actual hair.
Renaissance corset.
Sometimes hair pieces were soaked in lye and bleached to match the fashionable golden hue of Renaissance corsets weren't quite Thuesque wasted death traps of later centuries. Just wear a cap, they still meant business. It did. Renaissance known as stays or bodies at its finest. These early versions were designed to flatten the torso, hair, not cinch it. Removal and sculpting. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Mirrors were rare and expensive, because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank with help from servants? The stiffening materials, so you're made whalebone, have fewer rich, reeds or pasteboard. If you weren't, all of it Suninto linen and laced tightly across the back. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armor dardic, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. And corsets were unjust about looks. They were moral statements. Straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue. Slouching, on the other. Hands suggested moral laxity, and possibly demonic possession. So if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right. Underneath linen schmezzes helped absorb sweat because, newsflash, Florence in summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow. But elegance came first. Comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, corsets had one major benefit. They held the very thing in place. Unlike modern brass that pretend to offer support while staging a quiet rebellion be noon.
Ow.
Renaissance stays offered the kind of structural reinforcement usual lyra served for bridges. You could run, dance, or survive a fainting spell without anything shifting an inch. Of course, not everyone could afford such architectural fashion. Working-class women went without stays, favoring looser bodices and more breathable materials. But among the elite, corsets were essential. You weren't fully dressed without one, just tragically undone. It's the worst part. You had to eat while wearing one. Which brings us to the next Renaissance fashion paradox. Feasting like royalty, while trying not to split a seam or collapse from restricted airflow. In Renaissance Psychedelics, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It extended all the way to the dinner table, where fashion and food had a unity relationship. On the one hand, noble women were expected to attend lavish banquets and dinage in the social theater of feasting. On the other hand, they had to do it while squeezed into a corset so tight there. Internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacock, marzipan sculptures, and gilded fruit. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sup, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and potentially dangerous given the bond in your bodice. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your ribs. Sometimes the act of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which frankly only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private chambers, where they could finally remove the corset endeavor, a hidden stash of sweetmeats, or leftover cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it. And there were rules even for those. Certain foods were believed to affect the complexion. Cucumbers were discouraged. They made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged. Flush the cheeks with color. Some ladies even drank vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like ruining your gut lining. There was also the matter of digestion. In a corset, your stomach had nowhere to go. And women had to pace their eating carefully, or risk indigestion, bloating, or God forbid a very unladylike burp. The horror. So while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Dante, women mastered the art of elegant restraint. Eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the line of their gown. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tightened, and thiefwood politely nibbled, it was time to smell expensive. In Renaissance Florence, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch, it was a social weapon. A noble woman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her lineage, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a scandal. The Renaissance nose had standards. Common folk might trake of garlic, goat, and existential dread, but the elite, they wafted through salons and basilicas, trailing clouds of rosewater, musk, ambergris, and exotic spices. If you walked past a duchess and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her scent, she wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business. Italy, especially Venice, was the European hub for distillation, but the most coveted ingredients came from farther afield. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and ambergris, a waxy, oddly pleasant-smelling substance from the intestines of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable. Basically, the Renaissance equivalent of dabbing yourself with designer whale bath. These perfumes weren't just for pulse points. They were soaked into gloves, stitched into dress linings, and spray Danto handkerchiefs that ladies would flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came too close. Was soften. Streets were filthy. People bathed irregularly. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was armor, and for the ambitious beauty, scent layering was essential. First came the scented bath, usually a rinse of rose water or camphor, then a dusting of crushed violet petals, followed by an oil rubbed into the temples or wrists, and finally, a heavy mist of whatever concoction your apothecary swore would make men weep and rivals faint. Some even wore pomanders, delicate perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs around the neck or waist. Others dangled them from their belts. Like olfactory warning bells, approach with caution. I smell off cinnamon and judgment. But these potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained turpentine or tinctures, so strong they could trigger headaches, nausea, or fainting. One wrong blend, and you went from seductive ado, insufferable. Still, the right fragrance could open doors, or at least noses. Woman whose meld divine had power. Power to entrance, distract, or just to survive. Of a crowd of unwashed poets. Renaissance beauty was a battlefield, then fashion was the armor, and Florence was its glittering war zone. The fabriche you wore didn't just say something about you. It screamed, it sang. It flounced down the street, declaring your family's wealth, your husband's rank, and whether or not you had any shame in bankrupting him for a sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel. Imported, dyed, and woven with kind of care, usually reserved for saints' relics. Velvet was thick, heavy, and absurdly expensive. Wearing it in summer, a true power move. You were hot, yes, but you were important. Then came brocade, not content with mere color. Brocade brought patterns into the picture. Lions, vines, even entire religious scenes woven in gold thread. We're not talking about subtle accents. These were gowns that could double as altarpieces. The more intricate the design, the more time and money it took, which meant the more smugly you could nod at other women's inferior sleeves. Sleeves, by the way, were detachable. A practical feature turned competitive sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of sleeves to mix and match, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. Embroidered, puffed, slashed, pearl-encrusted. Some sleeves were so elaborate they needed their own storage system, and occasionally their own servants. Colors were coded too. Deep blues and crimsons were made with rare dyes like lapis lazuli and cochiol, pigments so expensive they were locked away like treasure. Only the rich could afford these hues, and some tie laws in places like Florence tried and failed to restrict certain colors to the nobility. But laws are boring. Dresses were not. Even the underlayers were ornate. Chemises were trimmed with lace. Petticoats peeked out in silken flashes, and girdles, belt-like accessories, weren't just decorative. Some were studded with gems and hidden pockets, for perfume, prayer books, or possibly revenge notes. All this fashion came at a price, literally. A single gown could cost more than a year's wages for a craftsman. And yet noblewomen didn't just have these gowns. They needed them. Every social event was a stage, and every outfit a statement. Wearing the same thing twice, social suicide. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle. Though in fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of brocade and silk, which was a pity considering how completely ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the Chopin, the most theatrical shoe ever invented. Chopins were essentially high platform soles. Think ancient Roman sandals crossed with stilts. And frequently, a servant on each arm. Walking unaided was considered both a physical feat and a social risk. If you fall, you didn't just lose your dignity, you might take out half the wedding party with you. In Florence, Chopins weren't quite as extreme, but the trend still trickled down. Wealthy women wore delicate pointed slippers, often made of velvet, embroidered with silk thread and lined with fur. These were indoor shoes. Outdoors, you wore patterns, wooden or cork platforms, strapped underneath your slippers to protect them. From the street, a practical solution unless you tripped and shattered ornicaps on cobblestones. Foot binding wasn't a thing in Renaissance Italy, but the pressure to have dainty, narrow feet absolutely was. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from sedan chair to palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? And then there were the stockings. Women wore finely knit hose made of silk or wool, tied at the knee with ribbons. These ribbons were sometimes scented because if someone caught a glimpse of your shin, you at least wanted to smell fabulous. Coarse lower-S women wore simpler. Shoes, sturdy leather for labor, clogs for wet work. What the noble class treated footwear like a secret weapon, unseen, impractical, and incredibly expensive. All of it reinforced a single message. Real ladies didn't walk. They floated. They glided. They suffered gracefully and in style. After hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Renaissance beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric and 2 in of breathable lung space. Courtly dances were serious business. These weren't sure carefree tavern-style reels. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every step was rehearsed, every movement symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply social ineptitude. A misstep, scandalous. You might as well shout, "I own nothing." In lapis lazuli and run barefoot into the Arno. For noble women, dancing was a test of composure. The most popular forms, like the pavin or the galliard, required gliding in precise patterns, keeping your gaze modest, and never under any circumstance breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is unfortunate because corsets didn't allow for deep breaths. Every galliard leap was a calculated gamble against passing out cold. And yet it was crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors, the way modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned how to turn, how to bow, how to fan yourself. Just in auto. Be mysterious. But not so much that you look sweaty. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes blistered and your ribs whimpered. There was also the matter of social strategy. Dancing offered rare opportunities to interact briefly with eligible men. Gloved hands touched for armament, eyes met during a bow, perfumes mingled. It was flirtation with footnotes, but say too much, move too boldly, or heaven forbid, laugh. You risked ruining your entire aesthetic affeous elegance. Background noise of every court event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it did. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt you for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you conjured, and when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to repowder your sweat-streaked Sousa before on two. The guests had departed. The candles had melted into waxy puddles, and the Renaissance noblewoman, divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally made it back to her chambers. But sleep? Not yet. First came the Renaissance version of the night routine. Spoiler alert, it was less self-care and moral-controlled deterioration. Step 1. The unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rose water, and raw egg whites. The lead-based Sarusa had to be gently removed, not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to lift the layers, hoping their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and fake braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to keep forehead wigs in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped the cat dung and quicklime they used for hair. Removal earlier in the week hadn't left bald patches, nay pressure. Next, the corset unlacing. Spiritual experience, one that usually involved gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs regained their original shape. Women could finally breathe. Not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper, "Never again." For the 100th time, the feet were peeled out of slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, your servant brought a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils. Or if you were, particular Duvat or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain, also possibly pestilence. And then at last the candle was blown out. Not with a huff still too improper, but a delicate puff like you wear apologizing. To the flame. You lay back, hairline too, and farther back than it was last year. Skin slightly more ghostly than the day before. Lungs recovering from corset trauma. Buttermarrow, you'd do it all again? 'Cause in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't just a look. It was a lifestyle, full-time high-stakes performance, with no intermission, and the audience everyone. 4. I became linked to crime syndicates and back-alley parlor. Tattoos in Japan carried a far more complex and layered identity, one deeply rooted in honor, mythology, and labor. Long before the Edo period, Japano's atutas were used as punitive marks, burned or etched into criminals' faces and arms to permanently brand them as outcasts. But by the 1600s, these crude symbols had evolved into something far more intricate, something closer to art, devotion, and even spiritual armor. In Edo, Japan, society was rigidly structured. Class divisions were clear. Samurai had swords, merchants had rules, everyone else they had restrictions. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict codes on dress and behavior, especially for the lower classes, ornate robes, luxurious fabrics, and flashy jewelry were reserved for the elite. But humanity always finds a loophole. For the common man, especially laborers, firemen, and gamblers, tattoos became a way to reclaim beauty, status, and identity. If you couldn't wear bouquet-onth outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so full-body tattoos flourished underground, hidden beneath plain work clothes, but revealed in baths, festivals, and moments of intimacy. These weren't random designs. They were stories, sleeves of swirling dragons, bodysuits of phoenixes, koish, cherry blossoms, Buddhist deities, and folkloric heroes. Each tattoo carried meaning. Koi, swimming upstreams, perseverance. A dragon on the back meant power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned, sometimes one painful inch at a time. And the process was brutal. There were no machines, no antiseptic creams. Artists called harishi used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink beneath the skin. The ink was often mixed with charcoal or natural pigments hammered in using rhythmic strikes. Sessions lasted hours. Full bodysuits could take years. But the result? A living mural thattered skin into storytelling. Yet, despite their cultural richness, tattoos remained illegal for much of the Edo period. Authorities viewed them as signs of disorder, deviance, or wastefulness. And so the art of Irizumi thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and completely invisible to the ruling elite. In Edo period Japan, where wooden buildings were packed like kindling and open flames lit every lantern, fires were constant and devastating. The samurai might have ruled the land, but when your neighborhood caught fire, it was the fireman Hikshi who saved your life. These weren't firemen as we imagine it today. They didn't use hoses or wear flame-retardant suits. Instead, they carried hooks, axes, and raw courage. Their job wasn't to extinguish fires. It was to tear down nearby structures and create fire breaks before the flames could spread. This meant climbing on tow-burning rooftops and dismantling homes by hand, often while embers rained from the sky. Naturally, these men developed a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood. And central to that culture was tattooing. Full body. Tattoos, irisi hormano, bekamiya, badge of honor among the Hakushi. Not only were they stunning displays of strength and endurance, they were deeply symbolic. Dragons for power, tigers for courage, gods and demons for spiritual protection. When a fireman stripped off his uniform to reveal a full suit of swirling ink, it wasn't vanity, it was armor. And the pain, it was part of the point. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured the skin was a rite of passage. Could endure that, you could face down an inferno. The tattoos weren't just decoration, they were proof of fearlessness. Commitment and pain endured for the good of the group. Some crews even shared themes with all members sporting similar motifs to reflect unity. You'd see entire teams marked with identical dragons across their backs or coordinated. Waves and blossoms swirling down their arms. This wasn't gang behavior, it was solidarity. Brotherhood forged through smoke and fire, but it wasn't legal. Tattoos were still frowned upon by the authorities, seen as vulgar or wasteful, especially for public servants. So, the Haikushi wore their ink beneath their clothes, only revealed in private baths or celebratory festivals, where their roliest local heroes gave them a pass, at least temporarily. Ironically, these same men were admired in their neighborhoods and feared by the elite. Their tattoos were marks of danger to some, of devotion to others. Beyond the fire brigades and labor crews, another group embraced the painful elegance of Irezumi, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers, Ovidu's, underground. These were the drifters of the Ukiyo, the floating world. A term that described both the pleasure quarters and the transient nature of existence itself. And in that fleeting world, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many of these men were bakudo, professional gamblers who roamed the country with dice, cards, and an uncanny ability to separate samurai from their stipends. While the bakudo had no formal organization at first, they lived by their own codes of loyalty, honor, and toughness. In a society that relegated them to the fringes, tattoos became a way to reclaim dignity, to turn a marginal life into one of meaning, one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Peonies, fierce warriors, gods of fortune, and snakes slithered across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative inkings of monks, or the civic pride of firemen. These were power statements, visual declarations that said, I don't follow your rules. I live by my own. Many designs referenced famous characters from Japanese folklore and kabuki theater. Heroes like Sakata Kantoki, Minamoto Neo-Shitsune, or even mythical rebels who challenged authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism. It was branding in a society where no one handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, these men were crucial to the underground economy. They lent money, maintained order in red light districts, and developed early proto-yakuza structures. Their tattoos became both a badge and a warning. Loyalty within, danger without. Tattooing shops flourished in this world, not always marked with signs, but known through whispers and connections. The Harishi became revered figures. Their work whispered about in baths and behind sake counters. To be inked by a famous master was an honor. To endure the hours of stabbing pain, a show-off grit. For gamblers and rogues, Irezumi was more than art. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a world that had no place for them. Though tattooing in Edo, Japan, is often portrayed as a masculine tradition of laborers, firefighters, and gamblers, women also left their mark, Sameta quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. While rarely documented in official records, female tattoos existed quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath the layers of silk and propriety. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, personal. Unlike the large mythological bodysuits of their male counterparts, women's tattoos were often smaller, discreet, and emotionally charged. Lovers would tattoo each other's names on hidden parts of their bodies inside a upper arm, on the inner thigh, near the collarbone. They got a gesture known as Irumi Choban, love tattoos. The popular phrase inked onto women's skin was Ininoi Azukasu, meaning I entrust you with my life. It was more than a vow. It was a declaration of emotional surrender, in pain. Men sometimes carried similar inscriptions, showing mutual commitment beyond what any formal wedding could offer. This kind of tattooing was especially common among lovers in the Ukiyo, the floating world off pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha reigned. Among high-ranking courtesans, tattoos were sometimes a tool of seduction.